welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. This is the Today episode, and we are today we're going to talk about missing people, and that is because February the 3rd is National Missing Persons Day, and we wanted to spend some time talking about the topic and to raise awareness of missing people. Someone is reported missing every 90 seconds in the UK, which is quite an astounding statistic, and that accounts to 170,000 people each year being reported missing. So, Jerry, how do we define a missing person? Because there's lots of literature on the topic, so it might be a good starting point.
Yeah, and that seems as if that would be a very easy thing to define, but as forensic psychologists, of course, we make it more complicated. But the police would define it as anyone whose whereabouts can't be established and or where they're located, and also that their well-being can't be confirmed. So that's a fairly sort of broad definition. So maybe we would think, in other words, how we might define a missing person as a forensic psychologist.
Yeah, and also I guess the literature talks about how a missing person is there's different types of missing people. You have missing children, there's missing adults, there's missing vulnerable people. So it really is a bit of a minefield of how to pick out a definition, I suppose, isn't it?
That's right, and I think often, like lots of things in forensic psychology, it's very underreported. So people who are in social services care are much more vulnerable to go missing and potentially being underreported. So people who are already vulnerable are more vulnerable to go missing as well. And so some people will just go and move somewhere else and restart their life in some ways, but other people will generally be missing and nobody's looking for them because they don't know they're missing. They're assuming they're somewhere else. And it's interesting then about if people are found, what happens, and if it's I read an account of a person who felt that he'd sort of started another life, and then when he was tracked by the Salvation Army, by his family looking for him, he felt almost then it was a strange thing for him to come back and have to come back, but his family at least knew he was well. But it's not as straightforward as we might think, that there'd be a happy reunion and people will be pleased to see each other. There's often a reason that people have decided to leave, but they're counted as missing by their family because they don't know where they are.
Yeah, I read some research about adult people that have adult missing people, and a large majority of the reasons that once interviewed after they were found, the reasons that were given were a marital breakdown or financial difficulty or feeling the need to just escape from their lives for a period of time, an unknown period of time. And I can imagine that then talking about that is it's really difficult, I would imagine. Like this idea of a psychologist interviewing a missing persons once they've been found, I imagine the sensitivity around that has to be really, really thought out, because it's people talking about their experiences. As we know, we have to think about how we do that, and there's a lot of trauma involved.
And I think when I've seen cases in the headlines over the years, I often think about that person when I'm out and think, would I recognise them if I saw them? What would I do? I mean, for instance, I wouldn't expect to go up and start talking to them and tell people they're looking for them, but I'd think, what would I do if I saw them? And also, having been bereaved myself, I've known that if, in those cases, you find yourself looking for the person that's gone, but it must be much harder if the person is missing. And I would imagine that all the time you'd be out looking. I remember with the case of Ian Brady, that there was one of the children that had been killed, and they didn't know where the child was buried. So that child was, they spent all their years looking for that child. And so that must be the hard thing, that sort of living in limbo, as they call it, of thinking of that you don't know if the person's alive or dead. And then you'd be looking for them every time you go out, I would imagine.
Yeah, not getting closure, I guess, always living in hope.
Yeah, I mean, they talk in the research about having similar feelings of grief, but there's also guilt and regret and anger at the person for not telling them if they're going somewhere. And again, cases stick in my mind. I remember watching a program about missing people, and they said that this family said they had dinner and the man said he was going out for a walk and he just never came back. And you would think, well, then, I often think about him. Where did he go? Why did he choose to just go out and not tell his family? And it can't be easy, for the reasons you've described, to tell people, actually, I've decided I want a new life. But then it must be so hard for the people. They call it ambiguous loss because they don't know, and that sort of feeling of uncertainty, and you can't move on. And even the financial cost to people have to keep up people's accommodation going, or all their status or bills and those sorts of things. That must be quite a cost to people, to even just practically how that would be managed.
I get I think, like, where do you begin? Like, so I was looking at the police evidence on how you begin, and it's always with the person that's notified the police that someone's missing. So they gather as much information as they can, and a psychologist can help out. That's where the psychologist can develop tools and assessments to get the most amount of information, so that the search can be narrowed, so that you maximise on the chance of finding them. But my mind just boggles at how do you know what's the right information to share, and what about what you know about somebody might be very different to what they're going through at the time, or where did I mean, I'm not saying sentences at this point, it's just questions, but it's just because it must be such a difficult task and so emotional for the people involved. I just struggle to think about that.
Yeah. And these, while we're psychologists sort of objectively trying to make sense of it, there's somebody's lives are being turned upside down. They're living the reality of it, so that must be more difficult. And you mentioned previously about sort of Liverpool University were doing research into this as to how forensic psychologists could help. What did they find?
They're still in the process of very early stages of the research, but one of the points that was talked about was the psychologist developing an assessment tool at the very early stages of helping the police out with that investigation, and they were doing that through interviewing people that had been missing and then had been found, and trying to figure out what is the most richest form of data that they could use, and what do we know about human behavior, what do we know about the personality of somebody that would make them, and what do we know about the context of and the environment of which they're living in at that time, how does that influence where they might be. I kind of looking at that research sent me on to another piece of research, and it was a police account, and they were talking about how there's so much prejudice or potential for prejudice. It wasn't stated definitely, but when you are collating information from somebody about a missing person, and then your task with then going on that search, like how much of your bias, how much of your prejudice or thoughts about the topic come into that, and how do you sift that through? Like, how do you know, okay, well, that actually is a really important piece of information when you don't know that person, and that's not helpful at all. I know that was something I hadn't thought about at all. If somebody I loved had gone missing and I would give loads of information, well, they can't use all that information because that would be an abundance of it. How do they pick which is the most important? And maybe that's where a psychologist can help.
Trying to sort of focus on what's the most important bit. And I suppose we're talking about people who just disappear, as it were, but then there's lots of other people reported missing after, for instance, after 9/11. There's still the majority of people that were missing at the time are still missing because they don't know whether they were even in the tower, so they haven't been able to sort of find out if those people are, or whether as was said, we know at the time some people came forward and said they were there when they weren't, to get money and get compensation. So equally, there could be people that did use it as an opportunity to go and start another life. So that's one instance, but there's other instances of that sort of event where people are still missing in the same sort of way.
And also, when does a missing person investigation turn into something more crime oriented? Like, when does it turn into an abduction case, or when do people fear kidnap or even murder? And when does the missing persons case go public? I think about, I think for me, my first experience of a missing persons case, I always think about the Madeleine McCann case, and that was everywhere, all over, and still is all over the public media. And I think, what kind of fear does that elicit in the country, or in families?
But what's also said is that how that case was over was so all over the news and everywhere, whereas there was other children missing at the same time that weren't represented and weren't given that sort of publicity. So again, that's something we need to think about, whether people from different ethnic minorities would be shown so much and given so much money and given so much investigation. And it's not to say that Madeleine shouldn't have had, it should be equal for everybody. So there should be more equality in terms of children missing and adults missing, that the same resources are put into it.
And what about, you told me that really interesting fact about people who have dementia and how they are viewed differently to missing.
Yeah, that was interesting, which I didn't think about when I started reading this. It was about people who are physically there, but their mind is missing. So they were differentiating between people who had some sort of physical illness that were making them be physically there, but actually their mind was not so accessible due to having dementia or Alzheimer's, which is the thing I hadn't thought about. So again, for when we think, when I started to think about missing people, that's what I thought about, was somebody who just disappeared, but there are obviously different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, I read it was a social psychology definition of missing people, and it talked about how their definition was more about how, if someone is missing, it means that the network of which they normally surround themselves in, they are impacted by the loss of that person, and that's how you know they're missing. And that the idea of somebody who's absent in mind, that fits with that definition, doesn't it? Because they might be sat there present, but they are absent.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of sort of looking at it slightly differently. But I imagine the spirit of the day that we're thinking about is about people who've just actually gone missing and not physically there. But it's so thinking about who they might be and where they might be, and who's likely to find them. How would people find them? And interesting, during lockdown, and maybe not surprisingly, that numbers reduced during the first national lockdown. There were less people go missing than would generally go missing, and I guess that makes sense that they would. But interesting, and another thing which developed, which I think we saw in lots of different spheres, as people starting, because they were at home, they started to do things online, so they started to look for people. So people were sort of spending their times, they sometimes called what do they call them, keyboard warriors, so they would start investigating, looking at records. And so they started in Toronto in 2019. One person looked over lots of YouTube footage about a person that was missing, and they looked over hours and hours of footage and found a car number plate, and then they helped the police to go and look at that. So people are joining in and doing things because they've got time and access to it that they might never have had before. So again, it's an interesting aspect of lockdown and of looking into this topic.
Social media is a fantastic platform where people can share reasons why people are missing, but also I guess I wonder how much it's a kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because I wonder how much social media actually is part of the reason why people decide that they want to for a bit.
Yeah. And some of the people I follow on Twitter who advertise, not advertise isn't the right word, but promote or identify people that are missing, will also say then, if they are then found, can you make sure you took off the original tweet, because otherwise that's out, and that's, if somebody googled that person, that would be all they'd be known for, was going missing. So again, that's another aspect I hadn't thought about before, because once things are out, they're out there, isn't it? So it's hard to bring them back. So the public would want to know, to try and look for them, and there's often more appetite to go and look for people if it's a child or a young person. But it horrifies me really to see the amount of people that go missing every day, of all ages, but particularly children. And I'm defining children as under 18, so looking at that age, that they're very vulnerable, and you wonder where they go and who's got them, and as you say, whether being trafficked or county lines, there's all sorts of other things that they could be then drawn into if they weren't in that originally.
That's a fascinating point about taking it down. That's not something I'd have thought about either.
No, I hadn't, until they sort of said that. And then you'd sort of engaging with them, and I do sort of think, I wonder where they are and if they're okay, and how would you find them, and what would you say if you did see them? Would they want to be found if they've got a good reason to go away? And some people might just think, this is what I want to do, and obviously got the right to do that. But I guess it must be hard. And for siblings, I guess, of a child as well, how much they would spend their time thinking about that lost child in a way, rather than having the life they might have had otherwise.
Yeah, maybe that's another avenue where psychologists can help in
Yeah,
victims
yeah.
of missing people.
Yeah, and the support of the families, I guess, because if, I mean, I don't know what the police investigations involve. If somebody gets reported missing, I don't think if it's the same as, you know, you'd have someone like a family liaison officer that'd be supporting you in the same way, and how long that might carry on for. Those sorts of things must be difficult for the family. And also just thinking about, I believe it's after 7 years you can declare them dead, which again must be a massive decision to have to make. And there might be practical reasons why you'd have to do that, but that must be an awful decision to have anybody to have to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this is, well, we've given a brief overview of some of the statistics, but it'd be really great to know more about the topic. So if there is any forensic psychologists out there that are working in the field who would like to come and talk about their work, or if there is somebody who has a personal experience, either by somebody who they've experienced someone they love go missing, or their own personal experience, and they'd be wanting to talk about that, then please do get in touch. At the start of this recording, we let you know that someone is reported missing every 90 seconds in the UK. This recording has approximately lasted for 16 minutes. And that means that throughout the recording, approximately 11 people have been reported missing in the UK since we started this video. And that kind of puts into perspective
just the impact on people's lives. I mean, that each one of those will have had such a massive impact, won't they, on people's lives and on and potentially for some time to come. Well, we know that a lot of people are found and they're unharmed, but there will be about 1% of the people that won't ever be found. So you know, it's a sobering thought, isn't it?
So all that leaves me to say is, let's talk forensic psychology.